Welcome and thank you for coming. My name is Ben Van Houten and I'm a staff attorney at Legal Community Against Violence. On March 2nd, 2010, the Supreme Court will hear oral arguments in McDonald v. Chicago, a crucial case involving a Second Amendment challenge to the City of Chicago's handgun ban. In McDonald, the Supreme Court will consider whether the Second Amendment restricts the actions of state and local governments, or whether governments will remain free to adopt laws to combat gun violence as they see fit. We are delighted to be joined this afternoon by Chicago Mayor Richard M. Daley, who has shown great leadership on this issue. Mayor Daley knows that guns, especially handguns, are responsible for far too many needless deaths and injuries in Chicago and other cities. His willingness to take on the NRA and to carry this cause all the way to the United States Supreme Court demonstrates the passion of his convictions. In defending the freedom to combat gun violence with tough local laws, Mayor Daley is standing up for communities across the country that have been ravaged by gun violence and want to do something about it. We hope the Supreme Court continues to allow him that freedom. Mayor Daley.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Ben, for those kind remarks. And I'd like to recognize Thomas McMahon, Mayor of Reading, Pennsylvania, Scott King, Chief of Police, Dean of the Firearms Committee and the International Association of Chiefs of Police, Terry Richmond, Research Director, Firearm Injury Center at Penn, Ron and Annette Holt, parents of Chicago victims, Blair Holt, who represents Purpose Over Pain, an organization of family members who lost loved ones because of gun violence in the city of Chicago. David LeBaum, who's president of Prosecuting Attorneys, and with me is Benna Ruth Solomon, counsel for the city of Chicago. Next week, also I want to point out that we have Congressman Quigley from the city of Chicago who's worked very closely with us in regards to this issue, and Brendan Moore, who's an attorney there, worked in staff, and I really appreciate Congressman Quigley's support in regards to the issue, not only this case, but guns in general, not only in Chicago and the state of Illinois, around the country. Next week, the Supreme Court will hear arguments that in a case of those gathered here today believe is one of the most important before the court this year. Its outcome could determine whether or not local governments around the nation have the legal authority to enact reasonable and common sense gun laws. Depending on its outcome, the case could also affect or open the doors to countless and needless legal challenges to local and state gun laws across the country. I'm joined today by leaders of many groups representing people from across our nation who support our belief that reasonable local gun laws are a responsible way to protect our streets and our communities, our families, and our children from gun violence. Since the post-Civil War days, the rights of cities and states to put these laws in place have been accepted by our nation and the United States Supreme Court. Now that right is in jeopardy. We all know that the unfortunate facts in 1 year, on average, more than 100,000 people in America are shot or killed with a gun. These are Americans of all backgrounds from every part of our nation, big cities and small urban and rural areas. If reasonable, local gun laws could have prevented even one of these needless deaths, it would have been important. Instead, unfortunately, violence does continue. It's the innocent victims and their families who ultimately pay the price. People like a 16-year-old honor student, Blair Holt, whose parents are with us today, who was shot and killed while shielding a friend from gunfire on a public bus. A 14-year-old honor student, Starkeisha Reed, who was in her home getting ready for school when she was fatally shot by a stray bullet. Or a 15-year-old swimmer, Andalani Purti, who was shot in the neck after asking some unwanted guest to leave a party, is now living a life as quadriplegic. What's at stake in this case for those of us on the front line of protecting our residents is nothing less than the safety of our streets. How many more of our children, our brothers and sisters, our mothers and fathers must needlessly die because guns are too easily available in our society? How long will the violence go on? And recent surveys show that Americans, including gun owners, support laws that protect the rights of law-abiding citizens to purchase guns, but also help us end the flood of weapons onto our streets and onto our communities. For many years, the city of Chicago has had strong handgun laws in place. Already, the gun industry challenge to our handgun law has been dismissed by 2 federal courts already. 17 Friends of the Court briefs representing more than 150 individuals and organizations have been filed with the United States Supreme Court in support of our position. Today, we stand here shoulder to shoulder on behalf of the people of not only Chicago, but the United States who have been victims of gun violence, on behalf of their families and loved ones, and on behalf of those who believe Chicago's current gun law is constitutional. In ongoing efforts, we will never sway away from our commitment to support the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution, while at the same time making our case that cities and states should be able to decide for themselves how best to protect our communities. Supporting our position is politically difficult for many people, and I understand that. But it's to their credit that those who are with us today have put aside politics and have risen above strong opposition from the NRA and the gun manufacturers to do what's right for protection of every American. I posed this question before, and it's still relevant today. Does anyone really believe that the founders of our nation envisioned that guns and illegal weapons could flood all of our streets and be used to kill our children and an average citizen? Of course not. But at the end of the day, what this case is about is not just the constitutionality of Chicago's gun laws. It's about whether or not this nation will stand up on the side of helping to keep our cities and towns, our streets and our communities, and our citizens safe from gun violence that is terrorizing our nation. And that is my concern. And that's why we're gathered here today. Thank you.
Mayor Daley, thank you for those wonderful remarks. We will be taking questions for all of today's speakers at the end of the presentation. Before welcoming Mayor McMahon, I'd like to say a few words about Legal Community Against Violence. LCAV is a national public interest law center founded in 1993 in response to a mass shooting at a San Francisco law firm. LCAV assists legislators and public officials in the drafting of firearms legislation and conducts legal and policy research on firearms issues, including the ongoing tracking of Second Amendment litigation. Since the Supreme Court's decision in District of Columbia v. Heller in 2008, over a dozen significant lawsuits have been filed against state and local governments across the United States, and criminal defendants have challenged a wide variety of federal and state firearms laws. So far, we've counted 220 decisions on federal and state Second Amendment challenges. That's just the decisions we know of, and just in the last 20 months. If the court holds in McDonald that the Second Amendment does restrict state and local action, LCAV anticipates a substantial increase in the volume of frivolous Second Amendment litigation already clogging the nation's courts. We also expect that the threat of litigation will be exploited to obstruct state and local efforts to adopt sensible gun violence prevention measures. LCAV was proud to file an amicus brief in support of the City of Chicago and McDonald. We also coordinated the filing of amicus briefs in support of the city and helped secure pro bono counsel for amici in need of legal representation. In total, 17 amicus briefs were filed, as Mayor Daley noted, in support of the City of Chicago, urging the Supreme Court to find that the Second Amendment does not interfere with the rights of state and local governments to enact a wide variety of reasonable firearms regulations. The amici come from all over the United States and many different professions, showing the diverse and widespread support for the city in this litigation. We are happy to see some of them in the room today, including representatives of the National Network to End Domestic Violence, the American Public Health Association, the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence, the Violence Policy Center, as well as Congressman Quigley. Supporters of Chicago's right to determine its own gun laws to combat gun violence include leaders at the heart of our communities. State and local governments across the United States, members of Congress, police chiefs, district attorneys, academics, gun violence prevention groups, historians, public health organizations, and other prominent civic groups. You'll be hearing from members of many of these professions today, and we hope that they will help you understand what is at stake in McDonald. I'd now like to introduce Mayor Tom McMahon of Reading, Pennsylvania.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. I want to also thank LCAV for organizing this and bringing us all together about an issue that I think is is very, very important, not only to the larger cities in this country, but also to the smaller cities. And I represent the mayors across Pennsylvania who are dedicated to reducing gun violence in their cities. And we have a strong commitment for mayors to stand together on this. So that's the reason I'm here today, is to help support the effort in Chicago, but also to let you know that there's a lot more of us out there who care and want to do something about it. For those of you who don't know it, Reading is a city of about 82,000 people in southeastern Pennsylvania. We are ranked as the sixth poorest out of 521 cities in the United States of 65,000 population or more. In 2005, Reading also had the dubious honor of being the most violent city per capita in the entire state. We had 22 murders that year. We brought that number down since then. Last year there were 12. But to my mind, it is still too high. Most of these people were shot to death, and firearms, especially handguns, also played a leading role in many of the rapes, assaults, and robberies that have beset our community. The good men and women in Reading's police force are doing all they can to keep our streets safe. In the last few years, two of them paid the highest price. Officers Michael Wise and Officer Scott Wirtz were both lost in the line of duty, shot to death as they tried to do their job. The gun used to murder Officer Wirtz was straw purchased, and the person who transferred the gun to a felon was eventually apprehended. The assailant was captured as well. In 2009 alone, we lost 6 law enforcement officers to firearm violence in the state of Pennsylvania. That's in addition to the roughly 1,200 citizens who are killed by guns every year in my state. Many of these victims are a far cry from hardened criminals and gangbangers. Many today, like Blair Holt, whose parents are here today, were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Of course, he couldn't have known that. He was on a bus coming home from school. In my state, it's the same. A few years ago in York, Pennsylvania, bullets took the life of 9-year-old Sierra Savage when she was caught in gang crossfire. It was Mother's Day. And in May of 2005, in my city, 15-year-old Tiffany Cologne was murdered, caught in the crossfire as 3 men fired shots wildly down a crowded street. Seeing this child in a casket changed my life. I have 3 daughters, and it could have been one of them. Disputes among criminals are being settled by guns with no regard to the consequences to the general public. A Head Start school in Reading had bullets shot through the windows while 4- and 5-year-olds played inside. Luckily, none of them were hit. For my fellow mayors and myself, this is a public safety crisis and much more. In this time of economic recession and overstretched budgets, the annual cost of firearm violence to federal, state, and local governments is substantial. Even as we have made progress in law enforcement, I have been forced to lay off 13 of my officers because we lacked the funds to pay them. Yet we are then required to spend critical funds to deal with the results of the mayhem. Researchers at the Public Services Research Institute recently calculated the price of gun violence and injuries at $4.6 billion per year. That's every year. This includes costs for medical care, mental health, emergency transport, police, criminal justice, and lost taxes. Think of what we could do with that money. I know some schools, job training centers, and hospitals in Reading that would very much benefit from it. So from my point of view, we're losing police officers. We're losing citizens. We're losing money, and now you are challenging the freedom that I have, that all state and local elected officials have, to try to do something about it. Combating illegal handguns in Chicago or Reading or any other city in America requires tough laws, smart policing, and a commitment by everybody in the community to work together. This is not only a big city problem, it's a society problem. Those who are challenging Chicago's handgun laws don't seem to understand the tough job we all face to keep our communities safe. For them, this is all about rights and it's about freedom. But I always say to people, there are 2 sides to the coin. Rights are on one side, responsibilities are on the other. And when they talk about freedom, they forget that there are other equally important freedoms. The Declaration of Independence, our inalienable rights. The first of those is not liberty, it is life. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so I ask, what about my freedom to keep my officers and innocent bystanders safe? Reading's freedom to make its own policies in the best interests of its citizens? The Holt's freedom to see their son grow up and go to college? The freedom that we should all have to walk down the streets free of fear that an emotional moment could suddenly become a deadly one. When you think about it, when it was adopted, the Second Amendment, if it stood for anything, was about making us less afraid in our communities, not more. I hope the Supreme Court does uphold Chicago's handgun laws. I hope that lawmakers and law enforcement do not give up their fight to keep illegal guns off the streets and out of the hands of criminals. I know that I will keep doing what I can. The innocent victims caught in the crossfire are my future doctors, lawyers, businessmen, journalists, mothers and fathers. Every one of them is precious to me, and every one of them deserves a chance to live in a safe community. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Scott Knight. I am the Chief of Police in the city of Chaska, Minnesota. And for several years, I have served as the chair of the International Association of Chiefs of Police Firearms Committee. I am here to talk about what all this means in the real world, what it means on our streets, and what this means in our police departments. My job is to keep my community safe, to prevent crime, to solve crime, and to make sure that the men and the women who are working at my home make it home safely. In order to do that job effectively, we need sane and comprehensive public policies that keep handguns out of the wrong hands. I am talking about laws that keep handguns away from criminals, gang members, and other prohibited persons. We need laws that will help us track guns used in crime. We need laws that make sure that firearms are stored safely, especially when they are in environments around children. Guns kill about 30,000 Americans a year, and they injure some 70,000 more. I understand that this number has lost some of its power to amaze us, and shame on us. Over the years, I can assure you that those numbers are very real to law enforcement. I also understand, because I hear it, that some people say that owning a firearm makes them safer. But there is a great deal of data that suggests just the opposite. My officers have seen over and over again that guns tend not to diffuse situations. Instead, they escalate situations. According to researchers at the University of Pennsylvania, over the past several decades, firearms have been involved in approximately 65% of all homicides, 55% of suicides, 40% of robberies, 20% of aggravated assaults in our country. And these numbers do not include the accidental shootings, which especially affect our children. The obvious solution to this senseless loss of life is reasonable policies on who can buy guns, what kind of guns can they buy, and where and how will they store them. This is common sense. Firearms don't belong, for example, in homes where there is a history of domestic violence, where there is a history of mental illness or criminal behavior. What private citizen needs a military caliber assault weapon? What private citizen needs armor-piercing rounds or bullets? Personally, I think that local governments should be free to judge for themselves what makes sense in their jurisdictions. And anyone who is responsible enough to own a gun should be expected to store it in a reasonable fashion, especially when children are in that environment. Of course, laws like these only make sense when police officers are able to enforce them. Unfortunately, it is often easier to track a stolen car than it is an illegal gun. Look at the situation today. Loopholes make it possible for criminals and other prohibited persons to buy firearms at gun shows without a mandatory background check. Folks, it's cash and carry, no ID required. Even when there is a background check, federal law calls for its destruction within 24 hours. This makes it almost impossible to identify straw purchasers who are putting guns into the hands of criminals. Because of these loopholes, state legislators and even municipalities have stepped up to to pass laws that we need to keep our citizens safe. This just makes sense. My professional interest in responsible firearms policies is also a very personal interest. A few years ago, one of my officers was shot in the line of duty. Fortunately, he lived. Between 1999 and 2009, more than 20,000 law enforcement officers were assaulted with firearms in the U.S. Of the 530 officers killed in the line of duty during that same time period, 486, more than 90%, were killed by a firearm. In just the past year, we remember the tragic deaths of 4 officers in Oakland, California, after a man pulled over for a routine traffic stop opened fire. In Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 3 police officers were killed and 2 others injured after a heavily armed man began firing at them as they responded to aid someone who was in a domestic dispute. In the Parkland suburb of Tacoma, Washington, 4 police officers were shot and killed in a coffee shop. I understand that we are here today to talk about a single important Supreme Court case, not the full spectrum of national and local gun law. But there is no question that the court's decision in McDonald is going to impact these issues as I have just outlined. It won't make any of them disappear, but a decision that limits the ability of state and local governments to pass laws to address gun crime and violence will certainly make them much worse for law enforcement. I hope that the Supreme Court understands and appreciates the need to keep our communities safe and to keep guns out of the hands of criminals, prohibited persons, and yes, folks, domestic terrorists. I can't believe that in this country we can't preserve our rights and our safety at the same time. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Mayors, Chief, on behalf of the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys, I'm pleased to be here. APA is a national nonprofit organization representing prosecutors. My goal here today is not to parse the history of the Second Amendment, nor to read our 49-page brief, although I'm proud of it and be willing to do that. Instead, I'd like to share with you some of the concerns about how extending the Supreme Court holding in Heller to state and local governments could make it much harder for my fellow prosecutors to do their job. You may not know it from recent events, but the United States has a long history of allowing state and local governments to determine what gun laws work best in their jurisdictions. In fact, 90% of all firearm convictions are made at the state level. Let me tell you, from a law enforcement perspective, this makes a lot of sense. Different communities face different public safety challenges. Our system of federalism recognizes the need for flexibility in crafting policies that address specific conditions at the state and local level. A great example of different situations calling for different firearm policies can be found in the recent headlines. The federal government has determined, for a number of very sound reasons, that neither loaded guns nor explosives of any kind have a place on an airplane. This policy reflects a situation-specific judgment weighing potential harm versus individual rights. This kind of calibrated policy making is not only traditional and constitutional, but essential, especially in areas with significant levels of firearm-related crime. For example, I know from prosecuting gang members that the vast majority of them have guns. In fact, most of the shooting deaths are committed by handguns. In areas with gang problems or high murder rates, targeting illegal handguns is absolutely necessary to reducing violent crime. True, this may not be the case everywhere, but it is the case, as we've heard from the mayor in Chicago and also Reading and the chief. It's true in Chicago and other major cities. In practical terms, restricting on carrying or possessing handguns allows police officers to stop and question anyone suspected of violating these laws without concern as to whether or not that stop may constitute an illegal detention. If a search takes place and it's found to be illegal, evidence of that search cannot be used in court to convict that defendant. Because of sensible laws like Chicago's, today the presence of a handgun on a city street will justify a stop, and then for officer safety, often a frisk. These actions save lives. If these restrictions are deemed to violate the Second Amendment and possession of a firearm is presumptively legal, police will be less able to intervene and prevent violent crime before it occurs. We will be tying the hands of the police officers who are on the front lines trying to protect our communities. Also, extending the Second Amendment's restrictions to the states will undermine regulation of violent criminal conduct at every stage in the criminal justice process. It will make it more difficult to investigate firearm-related offenses and also to prosecute and convict the criminals and flood the judicial system with the Second Amendment challenges. The prosecutor's job will become more difficult, and one of the responsibilities of the prosecutor is to make certain that the evidence seized was seized legally. We make a lot of strategic decisions, whether to prosecute, what may be an appropriate plea, whether to take a case to trial, based on what admissible evidence is presented in the case. If seeing someone carrying a firearm is no longer reasonable suspicion to stop and question, our ability to prosecute and secure convictions will be constrained, and it'll be a lot harder to keep criminals and their illegal guns off the streets. We should also expect the decision to apply the Second Amendment to the states and municipalities in McDonald will clog our courts with Second Amendment challenges brought by defendants claiming a constitutional right to carry that gun. Incorporation would threaten to embroil a wide range of firearm prosecutions and litigations similar to what we have under the Fourth Amendment exclusionary rule. Indeed, it would also complicate Fourth Amendment issues by themselves by threatening to redefine what is probable cause, what is reasonable suspicion, especially in firearm prosecutions. This means a lot more time for already overburdened judicial systems and more taxpayers' money for both the prosecution as well as the defense to litigate these challenges. We heard earlier that federally there have been over 200 Second Amendment challenges in just the last 20 months. If you look at some of the local challenges brought to gun ordinances have already been heard in the wake of Heller. Examples that we have cited is, one, a right to carry to an Obama rally a semi-automatic handgun. How about another, in Missouri, to be drunk and carry a loaded firearm? And finally, an opportunity to go after a gun license or obtain a firearm after being convicted of a domestic violence misdemeanor. Multiply these challenges around the country, and you begin to understand the fears of those who try to ensure the guilty are held accountable, the innocent are protected, and the rights of the victims are respected. Whatever the court decides, McDonald will neither cause every gun regulation to fall, nor silence every Second Amendment challenge. But disturbing long-standing and carefully crafted state and local policies will have the long-lasting effects and will affect the safety of our communities. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Terry Richmond. I'm an associate professor from the University of Pennsylvania and co-founder of the Firearm and Injury Center at Penn. Important for today's purposes, unlike the rest of the panel, I'm a nurse. I started my trauma career right here in Washington, D.C. in 1977, and I continued it into Philadelphia. During my decades as a trauma clinician, I've seen the lethal effects of firearms firsthand. I've cared for hundreds and probably thousands of patients wheeled into our trauma centers on the verge of death. We cannot save them all, and I've experienced the anguish of telling more than one family, your son is dead. Some of the families who've lost people to bullets are here today, and you will hear from one of them. But what about those who survive? Let me share with you an important lesson I learned from my patient Andy, who survived a close-range shotgun wound to his abdomen. With great effort and months of care in the hospital, we saved his lives. As a trauma team, we patted ourselves on the back and said what a great job we did, and we congratulated him for surviving. He came back weeks later into our unit, shouting at the top of his lungs, "You saved my life, but I am not healed." And Andy taught us a very important lesson, that for those who survive gun violence, their lives are forever changed. Gun violence is an epidemic in this country. It's not an exaggeration. The death rate from firearm injuries is comparable to that to HIV, which the CDC has recognized as an epidemic, and I don't believe any of us would question. A disproportionate number of firearm victims are young, Black, and male. I and my colleague Jean Lemaire published a study in 2008 showing that gun violence shortens the average American life by 3 months. If you're a Black male, your life is shortened by over a year from gun violence. At this point, I imagine you'll think that gun violence is predominantly an urban problem. I would like to debunk that myth. It is not true. Our team published a paper that showed that firearm death is pervasive a public health problem in rural America as it is in urban counties. In fact, the firearm suicide rate in our most rural counties closely resembles the firearm homicide rate in our most urban areas. More people die every year from firearm suicide than homicide. 2 important things we can learn from this: that firearm violence is a problem for all of us, regardless of where we live, and that we need the opportunity to work on local solutions that are tailored to deal with both the unique problems of self-inflicted deaths dominant in rural areas and the urban deaths from interpersonal violence. As a trauma clinician, I highlight the human cost of gun violence, but there is a cost in real dollars as well. In the year 2000, more than $1 billion was spent on providing medical care for people from gun violence. When you factored in loss of productivity, the total cost for the year 2000 is $35 billion. That's just from 1 year. If you think our victims have health insurance that will cover them, that really is not true. And as taxpayers, we pay for probably a good half of the care provided to people who sustain firearm violence. I am not a constitutional lawyer. I am a nurse. But I can't believe that our founding fathers really could have envisioned what we see every day in our trauma centers, that they could have seen the Saturday night specials of semi-automatics, easily concealable weapons, and how hard it would be to handle this problem. I don't think that they would want local governments not to deal with it. I've spoken as a clinician. I'm going to put on my scientist hat. Letting us find local solutions to public health problems is hardly a radical idea. It is not. If we have learned any lessons, one of the top 10 public health successes of the 20th century was the decrease in death due to motor vehicle crash. One of the top 10 public health successes. When we realized cars were killing people, we did not say get rid of all the cars. We looked at how can we live more safely in this world. We did so by looking at the multiple factors leading to death by car. Locally, we let states set their own speeding limits, their own blood alcohol limits, and their own driving ages. In Philadelphia, you have to drive 55 miles an hour. That would drive you nuts in a place like Wyoming on rural roads. Local laws make sense. I won't be in the courtroom the day the Supreme Court hands down its decision. I'll either be in a classroom teaching the next decade of providers for trauma care or in our ICU. Hopefully, not dealing with yet one more gunshot wound, but I can tell you I will be. I hope that we continue to move with rational laws, and I think a victory in Chicago in the McDonald case really might help slowly decrease death by gun.
Good afternoon. My name is Annette Nance Holt, and I am a Chicago firefighter and mother of Blair Holt. I'm joined here today by Blair's father, Ronald Holt. He's a Chicago police officer. Our job is to be there when you need us and to serve and protect the public. On May 10, 2007, we were unable to protect our son, Blair, from becoming a victim of handgun violence in Chicago. We understand that today's decision is about a court case, but we hope our story will remind people that this case is not about abstract legal theories. It's about real people. It's about mothers and fathers, sons and daughters. It's about our son, and it is about us, and it is about all the families who have been victims of weak laws that has let guns into the hands of criminals. Blair was a beautiful human being, and we were so proud to be his parents. He was on the bus coming home from school when a member of one gang jumped him. He jumped on board, and he pulled out a handgun. He started firing at a rival gang member seated in the back. Blair pushed a friend back into her seat and stepped in front of her, taking a single bullet to his stomach. They said he fought as hard as he could to stay with us. On his way to the hospital, he asked the paramedics to tell myself and Ron that he loved us. That was his last message to us before he died. Blair was 16 years old. He was our only child, and we will miss him every day of our lives. We are here because Blair and because of many sons and daughters hurt by handgun violence in Chicago. 4 other students were shot on the bus that day. 2 of them still have major health issues and other psychological issues as a result of the shooting. In a recent 16-month period, 508 students were shot in Chicago. That's enough to fill an entire school. And it is not just young people, and it is not just about Chicago. You've heard speakers here today say that we lose about 30,000 Americans every year to gun violence. In the last 2 decades of the 20th century, more Americans died from non-combat related firearm injuries than have died in the battle of all of American history, going back to 1775. Among young people, the Centers of Disease Control have found that more teens die each year from gun violence than from all other natural causes combined. In fact, gunshot wounds are the second leading cause of death for African American teenagers. The CDC has also determined that a young person in America is 12 times more likely to be killed by a gun than in 25 other industrial nations combined. Let me briefly tell you about some of them, because this problem is so much bigger than what happened to Blair. Among those we've lost to gun violence are a 14-year-old girl just reading in her bedroom window, an 18-year-old gospel musician unloading music equipment in front of a church he was going to play at, a 17-year-old honor student from a magnet school who was bound for college in Wisconsin. His mother thought he was safe after leaving a birthday party. He was gunned down. I actually wrote down a whole list of young people taken from us too soon. They should be here. They should be speaking about something other than me speaking about guns and death. And these are just a few of the many examples that I have personally become familiar with since my tragedy. And if I may, I would like to add one more name to my remarks here, and that's Ron's cousin, Officer Eric Lee, who was gunned down in the alley in Inglewood while on duty as a Chicago police officer, doing his job to serve and protect us. You might ask, what good is Chicago's handgun law if so many of our young people are still being shot? All I can say is, imagine how many more would be if the law were not there. We are all here today because our fate has set us apart. But imagine the parents you will never meet, the parents of children the law has saved, parents who do not even know how lucky they are. I wish I was one of them. We would give anything to be one of those parents. All we can do, though, is stand here today to let you know that for each death, each injury that a handgun causes, the hurt is magnified. It spreads across the country, across schools, across churches, across families and friends. It makes victims of us all. So I ask you, where is my life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness? Where is my son and all the other children who we lost too soon? They are all buried in a cemetery, and we are all left to somehow survive the worst tragedies in our lives. We buried our children. No one should ever have to do that. Whatever the Supreme Court may say, we need sanity and real-world solutions to the epidemic of handguns in this country. Because when the love of guns in our culture far outweigh the love of people and those who protect us, that's not sane at all. To anyone fighting to expand the Second Right Amendment on principle, I have just one question. Is that principle you are willing to have your child die for? Is that a principle that you would lose your child for? Thank you.
Thank you, Annette Nance Holt and Ronald Holt, for sharing your story with us. We will now take questions for all of the people who've spoken today, and we are also joined by Benna Ruth Solomon, counsel for the City of Chicago. Before your question, if you could identify your affiliation and who you are.
I'm Greg Storr with Bloomberg News. I have a question for Mr. McMahon. What kind of gun laws do you have in Reading, and in particular, what laws do you think might be in jeopardy if this case comes out the wrong way from your standpoint?
Good question. We have passed an ordinance on lost and stolen guns, and we think that because we were not able to get it through the Judiciary Committee at the state level, we'd had to take efforts at each of the municipalities. So far, we've had 21 municipalities pass that, and that is mandatory reporting of lost and stolen guns, which we believe tracks back to the trafficking and a straw purchase issue. The second one, which I've adopted and based on Lancaster law and which passed on to Allentown, is one that's called shots fired in an urban environment. And we have too many people that use guns as if they're fireworks. And we believe that when the shots are fired in the air, the bullets are going to come down somewhere. And it jeopardizes not only the people in that area, but it also terrorizes our community. And when people come into my office and say, "I'm leaving town. I'm not gonna stay where I have to wake up in the middle of the night and hear shots fired," that's what those are two which would be impacted, I think, pretty significantly.
Any other questions?
From the Wall Street Journal. Mayor Daley, if I could just get you to respond to the comment that Ms. Holt made about the policy or the principles of the Constitution. The First, Fourth, and Fifth Amendments all apply to the states. Why shouldn't the second?
Well, I firmly believe that, we talk about the right to bear arms and questions like that, but in this day and age, when we think the right to bear arms in all of our communities, that means any type of a weapon. I don't think our founding fathers or anyone ever believed that these types of weapons would be on the soil of the United States of America. And to me, every jurisdiction, local jurisdiction, counties and states, have a right to talk about the health and safety of their communities. And elected mayors and elected governors and elected presidents of county board have the right to set reasonable, if they want to talk about reasonable, common sense gun laws. And to me, dealing with the issue not only as a mayor but formerly as a prosecutor, far too long America talks about violence throughout the world, and we don't look in a mirror and see the violence that is inflicted on a daily basis to our children, to our sons and daughters and our brothers and sisters and our parents on a daily basis. America is just enthralled with guns. We think guns will solve the global economy. We think guns will solve all the issues. We've lost perspective on looking in a mirror and maybe not seeing yourself, but see John F. Kennedy, to see Martin Luther King, to see Robert Kennedy, to see Blair Holt. That's what we have to do. And this is not, we get sometimes caught up in all the constitutional questions, rightfully so, but looks back at it, we're just talking about common sense gun laws. And if we can't protect our own children, I guess we have to protect them in the rest of the world.
Oh, I'm sorry, sure.
Hi, I'm Chris Castellan with the Oklahoman. The lawyers that have spoken today seem to think that no matter how the court rules in this case, that there are going to be all kinds of challenges. Am I interpreting that right, that no matter how they rule, the parameters of this are just going to be continually tested because of Heller?
I guess I'll be the first to speak up. David LeBon on behalf of the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys. I think that in one direction, in other words, if the second is incorporated to the states, absolute, unquestioned, hang on for another round, and that's what I was referring before about the Fourth Amendment. How many search and seizure cases are heard by the U.S. Supreme Court? Fifth Amendment, what does Miranda mean? How many cases there? So I will say, unquestioned in my opinion, if the Second Amendment is incorporated to the states, hang on. The question to the mayor as to what gun laws might be impacted, I don't know that anyone can give you legal certainty today of what is reasonable and what's unreasonable. On the other hand, if the Second Amendment is not incorporated, I would suggest there's going to be a lot less litigation. This is the opportunity for the court to then quiet what did they mean when they passed down Heller. Heller is good law. It's absolutely for all of the federal jurisdictions. But this is the opportunity for the court to go ahead and clarify that. So I will suggest much less future litigation if it's not incorporated. But if it is incorporated, we're going to spend a lot of our time figuring it out.
I would add to that even though Heller did not hold that the Second Amendment applies to state and local governments, immediately after Heller, lawsuits were filed against jurisdictions across the country on state and local laws.
Mayor Daley, Melina Caruso, the Washington Bureau of ABC News. Regardless of what the court decides with this case, what would be the ideal gun laws for a city like Chicago?
Well, first of all, I'm not going to talk about that because we really believe that the position, I think all of us taken, and not just Chicago, but the families, victims of families, police chiefs, other mayors, other organizations that you heard about, we believe we can be successful in this. If not, then you have to go back to the drawing board and figure out from one community to another what effect this is going to have upon the safety of our citizens and first responders, both paramedics, fire and police officers, all first responders.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you everybody for coming.